what we traditionally associate with knowledge is a very left brain, somewhat intellectual, somewhat Western concept where you keep adding more and more information. But true knowledge is actually wisdom. And for that, you need to sometimes shed a lot of clutter, shed a lot of baggage, go deeper to your own roots. There is this line from Harivansh Rai Bachchan's famous poem Madhushala. It says, "Raah pakad tu ek chala chal aa jayega Madhushala," which means choose one path and stick to it, and you'll reach your destinations.
Welcome back, my dear listeners. This is the next episode of Inspire Someone Today, your channel for creating ripples of inspiration. Every episode brings in an inspirer, and today is no different. And we all are told that in life and in career, it's not a straight trajectory. It is a squiggly line to get to the point where we would want to accomplish in our life and careers. And our guest today is somebody who has created a template for those squiggly careers, somebody who started as an investor, a much accomplished author of bestseller thrillers, mindfulness coach, and strategist. It's an absolute joy for me to welcome Venkatesh on Inspire Someone Today. Venkatesh, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Srikanth. It's wonderful to be on this podcast. And I must say, I was very impressed with the quality of both the speakers and the topics on your podcast. So truly honored to be here today.
Thank you so much, Venkatesh. So you add to the gems that we have creating on this platform called as Inspire Someone Today. So I did mention about creating squiggly careers. And you, like I said, started as an investment banker, an author, mindfulness coach. Would love to hear from you. How did these different trajectories happen to you?
I think your description is very accurate. I think the career has been squiggly. I think in a way it mirrors life itself. There is this saying, I think by John Lennon, that life is what happens to you while you're too busy planning for it. So in a way, that's what happened with my career as well. So after I did my electrical engineering, to be honest, the 4 years at IIT Delhi taught me that I was not really made for electrical engineering. And I was much more interested in pursuing a career in management. So after 2 years of pursuing my management, I joined investment banking. I had a good set of years, first in various roles in the equities markets with Credit Suisse and JP Morgan, and then as an investor, a private equity investor with a couple of Australian firms. So, while that was satisfying in its own way, over the years, I did feel a sense that there was something that was missing, a missing ingredient, if you can say, which didn't make that mix complete. And here and there, I would have, flashes of inspiration. I still remember, for instance, when I was working with Macquarie, an Australian firm, helping them make infrastructure investments in India. I had gone to inspect a toll road that we were looking to invest in. And I saw this small little signboard which said Lothal. And my mind immediately went back to my, grade 7 or grade 8, when we had read that Lothal was one of the Indus Valley civilization sites. And I asked the driver to take a detour. And it was just fascinating because there was this place pretty much deserted. And this was one of the world's oldest ports. 4,000, almost 5,000 years ago, an Indus Valley civilization site. Completely abandoned now. There's a small little museum there with some artifacts. And you can see some remnants of the structures that they had built. Most of it is in ruins, but it was just fascinating. This was one sort of bout of inspiration. And when that happened, I would feel inspired to write something. And then, work, deadlines, investment committee meetings, etc., all that took over. And the next time I would feel inspired would be 3 months later. But over a period of time, I realized that these bouts of inspiration were becoming more frequent. And somewhere I started putting pen to paper, and that's how I started writing. And once I started writing, over time, it gained its own momentum. There was actually a period when I was traveling a lot. I was working for a firm, shuttling between Singapore and Vietnam, and to some extent to meet family in India. And I ended up taking almost 300 plus international flights over a span of 2.5 years. And interesting that, While on one hand, it would leave me feeling tired. On the other hand, I realized that that period within the flight, when there's no emails, no phone calls, nothing, actually allowed me to go deeper into my own and tap into my own creative instinct. So that's how the writing part came about. Initially, I had to take some tough calls in terms of leaving a conventional corporate job and branching out and setting up my own management consulting firm. But today I'm able to manage juggling between writing and my coaching and management consulting work. Mindfulness is a different journey. In a way, it's followed its own parallel trajectory. And at some point, the last few years, it's all come together. The three passions that I have: writing, mindfulness, and of course, the whole leadership coaching. And I'm a stock market investor, so I continue to invest quite actively as well. So in some ways, it's all come together the last few years.
Very interesting tentacles out there, right? One element that kind of jumps out is mindfulness coaching, right? So we kind of attribute mindfulness to a lot of stillness, and growth is about expanding. So in lot many ways, I would see this as an oxymoron of sorts, mindfulness and growth. And you're out there helping people to figure out things and help them to grow through mindfulness practices. So let's kind of look into this element of mindfulness. Walk me through the yin and yang of mindfulness. How did you kind of start observing some of these practices, and what benefits have you seen either for yourself or for your clients?
Sure. So, again, my journey with mindfulness goes back more than 25 years, actually, when I was in college and I attended my first mindfulness retreat. And then for many years after that, I sort of lost touch with it. Again, once again, I did a retreat probably about 15 years ago, but it's been in the last 8, 9 odd years that I've been very regular with my own personal mindfulness practice. You very correctly pointed out that mindfulness is about stillness, while growth seems to imply a certain type of dynamism. So actually, if you take a deeper look, the two are not that unrelated. So there is this saying in this famous ancient Chinese text called the Tao Te Ching. It says that in the pursuit of knowledge, you gain something every day, but in the pursuit of Tao, the ultimate truth, you shed something every day. So what we traditionally associate with knowledge is a very left brain, somewhat intellectual, somewhat Western concept where you keep adding more and more information. But true knowledge is actually wisdom. And for that, you need to sometimes shed a lot of clutter, shed a lot of baggage, go deeper to your own roots. So the concept here is that we actually have an inherent greatness within us. But to get to it, we need to shed various layers. And, in some ways, it rhymes with areas very much outside of the traditional, associations with mindfulness. So, I've been a stock market investor now for 27 odd years. I began my career in the stock markets. Warren Buffett, it's all about simplicity. You don't need to complicate with, huge like 500 line Excel models, etc. There are a bunch of fairly simple tenets. The difficulty is in being able to stick to the simple and resist the urge to overcomplicate. So in that way, mindfulness is actually conducive to growth because growth is not about cluttering and adding a lot of baggage. In fact, shedding a lot of baggage actually enables you that capability for growth is inherent within us. Just as creativity, we all grow to be, from children to adults. You have saplings growing into plants and then into trees. It's a natural process. So growth is a natural process. We just need to stop interfering with it. And so going back to stillness actually is conducive to growth.
That's a great point you make, which is need to stop hindering the growth process. While it is a natural phenomenon, what are some of those elements that we bring in as individuals, as professionals, that hinders this growth?
I think a lot of these hindrances, resistances, roadblocks have to do with fear. There is a desire to stay within what we call our comfort zone because we are afraid to fail. We are afraid to fail because of multiple reasons. We fear, ridicule or loss of reputation. More importantly, we fear failing in our own eyes, sort of because our own self esteem is a little fragile and we are hesitant to be proven wrong about our own capabilities. And then there are other things too. There is an exaggerated need for financial security sometimes, which prevents people from taking the entrepreneurial plunge. When people look to pursue creative pursuits, there is the feeling that I don't have time or I don't have mind space. But the truth is that we actually spend 2, 3 hours a day on our mobile phone. So there is a lot of time that we can potentially free up. You hear about, and quiet quitting has become a bit of a buzzword nowadays. It's much easier to seemingly stay in some sort of suboptimal state than to take a harsh call and actually bite the bullet, pull the plug, and do what you really set out to do with full zest and purpose. So, yes.
For a lot of the listeners who are listening to this conversation, they'll not gain the perspective of mindfulness or become mindful just by virtue of listening to this particular podcast. You did mention that for you it has been a 25-year long journey to be at a space where you are. If you were to kind of outline what are some of the benefits that you yourself have felt by virtue of this practice, or somebody learning the teachings of mindfulness from you, how have they benefited? That would kind of help our listeners to kind of say, okay, why mindfulness and what can they go about doing?
Sure. So, at its core, mindfulness is really two things. Of course, now mindfulness it's also become a buzzword, so there are a
Zillion
million
things.
interpretations of it. But as I understand it, and I'm speaking from the point of view of a practitioner, really, there's just two parts to it. The first part is awareness. Awareness not just of the external environment, but awareness of how you respond to the external environment and awareness of your own inner beliefs, inner impulses, and so on. And the second part is to be non reactive. Our default mode is to react to a situation or a person based on our own past conditioning, our past biases, etc. Once we are aware of that, we can impose just a little bit of a gap between the stimulus and the reaction. And that's where magic happens, because in that gap is when you have the ability to not react to someone with a preconceived notion. So there are two parts to it. So there is awareness and there is non reactivity. I've personally followed a meditative practice. I did my first Vipassana meditation camp when I was in college. I went back to it about 15, 17 years ago, and I've been following it daily. But unlike a lot of people who seem to think that there is only one technique that works, the truth is that most meditative techniques will eventually, if followed properly, lead you in a certain positive direction. There is this line from Harivansh Rai Bachchan's famous poem Madhushala. It says, Raah pakad tu ek chala chal aa jayega Madhushala, which means choose one path and stick to it and you'll reach your destination. So it's the same with mindfulness meditation. So there's no need to be too rigid about which particular technique you follow. If anybody has the inclination to pursue meditation, just choose one technique, stick to it, be regular. Even something as, I think, half an hour daily, one will start seeing significant results. But if you don't have half an hour, even 20 minutes to begin with is good enough. For me personally, mindfulness, there's a host of things. There are some which are internal, which are not visible to other people. So people, usually say that mindfulness helps improve focus, it helps you become calmer, and so on. But for me, I think it's a means to really come closer to my own inner core and find my own inner compass. So in a way, it's like taking a lot of the dust and etc. off from the windscreen and able to see yourself actually, or from the mirror, and just be able to see yourself much more clearly. So focus, being calmer. I mean, nobody's perfectly calm, but being calmer than earlier, these are all byproducts. And interestingly for me, so as I said, I started my career in the equity markets with Credit Suisse and JP Morgan and was a private equity investor and so on. I actually have learned more about investing in the last 7, 8 years when I've been pursuing both mindfulness and writing more actively than in the preceding 20 years of being in these various jobs. Because even something like investing, which seems far removed, is actually, I would say, 20% about knowledge and skills and 80% temperament. Now, the 20% knowledge and skills is a hygiene factor, so you can't do without it. But that's not what distinguishes one investor from another. That's not what makes a great investor. So this is just one example. I've seen, in my work with companies, etc., that even, with individual people as well as with leaders, being able to be aware of what you're doing, aware of the consequences, aware of your motivations, and doing it consciously, which is basically the essence of mindfulness, actually pays huge
Super.
dividends.
Looks like the positives of doing mindfulness outweighs a lot more than not doing it.
Absolutely. I think the only downside is having to allot that half an hour or, 20 minutes
Making the
a
time,
day.
as they
Yeah.
say, not finding time.
Yes,
And with that, you
absolutely.
have also been a prolific writer. And I must say, though, I must confess that I have not read your books, but have been an ardent follower of your articles. And one of those articles that really touched me was your article on finding your aha moment. So I'll not steal the thunder. I'll let you to kind of talk about it and how can people find their aha moments in such a digitally vociferous world that we are living today.
Yes, this is quite interesting, and maybe I'll share a little bit about my own journey with aha moments. So I told you that when I was working in investments world, I used to have these flashes of inspiration, which led me to write a little bit. The big turning point for me was the realization that I could write at will rather than having to wait for a moment of inspiration. Write at will basically means you allot a little bit of time every day, in my case, sit in front of the computer and try to see what comes out. And many a time you just stare at a blank screen and nothing really happens. But having the discipline to do that every day made me realize that the flashes of inspiration started coming more frequently, and slowly these aha moments started happening. And working backwards, I've now realized that there is a way to sort of make this happen more frequently. There are actually two parts to it. I think one part is what they call deep work, which is allot a certain set of time to pursue whether it's a creative or an entrepreneurial activity, or it could not be, maybe writing, or maybe preparing a business plan, or maybe just writing copy for an ad or music or whatever. But that uninterrupted work is quite important. Often I've realized that even if there's somebody who, Bill Ackman, this famous hedge fund manager and investor in the US, says that if someone comes in and asks him for coffee, that just interrupts his flow of thought. Even this famous writer, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, I think this was a couple of 100 years ago, he woke up from a dream and a full poem came to his mind and he started writing it. And then somebody came and knocked on the door and he just forgot the poem. So this poem, Kubla Khan, is today still an unfinished masterpiece because it was interrupted by this person. So once you do this deep work, you sort of get into the zone. The zone is sort of a bit like what I'm presuming happens to Federer in the middle of a tennis match, or, we can all get to this state when things seem to flow naturally, when, you're creatively stimulated, and yet the thoughts seem to think themselves. The book seems to write itself. And, that's what they call being in the flow, I guess. So that state requires deep work, and more importantly, it requires regularity. So I have to stare at that blank screen for 20 days, and maybe on the 21st day there is this feeling that happens. But over a period of time, the trajectory, the number of times this happens, and all, this is the zone of creativity, really.
And what I hear you telling in couple of these instances is there's no substitute for consistency here. The more consistent you are in your practices, be it mindfulness, be it writing, be it whatsoever, the closer you get to that end goal than otherwise. It's not moments of spark.
Absolutely. In fact, this whole fascination with this, the aha moment, somewhere when we say aha moment, we seem to focus on the very short term type of thing, but actually, yes, it is all about consistency. The other thing that happens is that when you're consistent with something, we bat with our conscious mind most of the time, but the subconscious, or what the psychologists call the unconscious mind, doesn't come into play in a lot of when we do things very consciously. But when you are consistent with something, in some ways, the unconscious mind is doing its own, jig. It's joining dots. It's making connections that our conscious mind would never dream of making. It's a bit like this scientist Kekule, who who discovered the structure of the benzene molecule. He had been consciously working at it for, I think, many months. And then one night he slept and it came to him in a dream. The benzene cyclical structure. The dream was that a snake is there and it's coiled and it's catching hold of its own tail. And he woke up saying, oh my God, that's the structure of benzene. Now, what's happening there? The subconscious or unconscious mind is at work. And it is able to work because of the consistency that has been put in conscious.
If you are ready, we will get started with the power of three round.
Yes, ready. Hope the questions are not too difficult.
Three practices that are unique to Venkatesh.
Well, one is this free-flowing writing that I do. I'm sure a lot of writers do this, but from a layman perspective, the fact that I give this time and let my mind free float and come up with ideas, that's one. The second is my meditation. Again, it's not like I'm the only one who does it, but for me, it's something that's very precious and something I do every day. The third thing is just I love making linkages between completely unrelated topics. So history, mythology, investing, business, maybe biology, etc. And some of these, I just love making
Great.
these
You
connections.
did mention about meditation. Is there a specific time that you recommend is a good time to do meditation, or any time is a good time?
If you're not doing meditation, then anytime is a good time. But if you are, then I would say that morning is best, simply because during the day, there's a lot of impressions from the outside world which enter your mind. So if you do it in the later parts of the day, you're just undoing what has already been done during the day. If you do it early in the morning, the mind seems to be less cluttered and therefore you're able to go deeper. But having said that, if you're not doing meditation, frankly, just make a beginning, do it whatever time you're able to.
So, if there is no limitations or no restrictions, three guests that Venkatesh would want to invite for dinner or lunch.
So I'm presuming these are people who are alive. So, or are there? Yeah, people who are alive. Okay. I would like to have somebody creative, maybe Andrea Bocelli, the tenor singer. I just love his music. More importantly, there seems to be a lot of soul in his singing. He was born visually impaired, and that sort of adds even more color to his song. So Andrea Bocelli would be one person. I think Amitabh Bachchan, frankly, and I'm not saying this in a starstruck way. I'm saying this as somebody who has a functioned at his peak, b been an icon to billions. He also has a heritage from his father of poetry, etc. So it would be, I'd just be curious to hear about his life experience. The third person, I would say maybe someone like Sachin Tendulkar. I'm just curious to understand, how he gets into the flow, which I talked about earlier, and just his experience of being in the zone. Yeah. So these are three people who are alive. If you include people who are not alive, then yeah, the list would be longer.
That's a good three list from music, sports, and entertainment. Three advices that has steered you in good faith so far.
One was that somebody during my management school years told me that, as is typical, frankly, of students, I, would end up sleeping very late and waking up late and just having a haphazard routine. And he told me that if your own graph is so haphazard, you have very little ability to add on. Life has its own set of haphazard external triggers. So, if it's haphazard on haphazard, will just lead to complete chaos. Frankly, I didn't follow the advice at that time, but many years later, I've just realized, for instance, in my writing, I'm able to, somebody asked me, my God, this is a thriller and there's like a lot of suspense and intrigue. How are you able to craft something like this? I'm able to do that because internally I'm feeling somewhat calmer and less zigzag. So I'm able to experiment in my imagination. If I was myself not disciplined and had haphazard habits, I don't think I would be able to bring that extra haphazardness into the book. So that is one piece of advice. Another, I think a couple of lines which have just inspired me. One of them, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. This is a line from the Tao Te Ching. And it's beautiful. I realized one should dream big, but start small. Because sometimes if you dream too big, what happens is you're not able to convert that into practical, actionable tips which you can do the next morning. So dream big, but start small so that, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. The third one is the same John Lennon quote that I told you about. Life is what happens to you while you're busy planning for it. I used to be in the early parts of my career a bit too structured and methodical, I think. Over time, I learned to let go of that left brain way of thinking, learn to let go of that illusion of control and bring in the surprise and magic which comes with the right brain.
So you always get to hear this question, what advice do you give to your younger self? I had twist to that question, which is, what the advice would you give to your older self?
Well, that's an interesting twist. I would say I'm hoping I don't lose my connect with my inner child, but that is something I would want my older self to be aware of. That the joy, the magic in right now, creativity, writing provides me that magic. But in whatever form, I would want to retain that ability to be that sense of curiosity, wonder, delight that a child has. I would want to retain that into my old age. Other than that, of course, yeah, watch what you eat, take care of your health. I think as one grows older, one realizes that this is quite important. And and the third part, yeah, don't lose connect with one's own inner compass. Sometimes when you get very carried away with whether it's work or worldly commitments or social engagements, etc., etc. It's and nowadays with social media and everything, it's very easy to lose one's connect with one's own inner self. I would not want to lose that connection. So yeah, that's something I would want to tell my older self.
You've been doing great on the Power of Three round, Venkatesh. This is the last of Power of Three round question, which is asking an author, what are the three book recommendations that you have for all of us out here?
So, well, I would three books that have inspired me. One of them is this book called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. He was in a Nazi concentration camp and he survived. And just based on seeing what are those ingredients that enabled people to survive, he wrote this book. And one of the main messages is about having a sense of purpose. So, Man's Search for Meaning is certainly one book. The three books I would recommend would be on the somewhat more philosophical side, because thrillers, etc. Anyway, one gets to read. For people who want to believe in a simple way to live life, the Tao Te Ching is a great book. The third book, actually, another book which introduced me to the richness of our own heritage, was by Christopher Isherwood and Swami Prabhavanand. I think it's called A History of Indian Philosophy. So it provides a great overview of all the schools of Indian philosophy. And reading that, so I read it in college, it just made me realize how rich our heritage is. Yeah. So all three non-fiction. I mean, if you ask me about thrillers and so on, I have a bunch of favorites. But yeah,
What's coming from the stable of Venkatesh?
well, I so the first two books, Calcutta and Agniban, were both thrillers with a historical angle. My third book, which should be out early next year, is a thriller set in the world of the stock markets. Yeah, there is another thriller with a historical angle in the works, but I think the thriller set in the stock markets will come out first.
Nice. Many congratulations.
Thank you.
Great. That was the Power of Three round, Venkatesh. Thank you so much for that. So we'll check along in our conversation here. As we have been talking about you wearing multiple hats, multiple roles, and one thing that is always intriguing, how do you bring balance to these multiple roles that you play? Is that an author in the morning, a stock market investor in the afternoon, and a mindfulness coach in the evening? How do you bring a sense of balance between the multiple roles you play? And that is so true to many of us, right? We play multiple roles, not necessarily in the same league as yours, but as a colleague, as a leader, as a son, as a father, spouse, etc.
No, that's a great question. And to be honest, it's something that is still a work in progress for me. I think it's something that we all struggle with. A few things over the years that I've begun to realize. One was that to bring a sense of inner centeredness to each of these roles, to make sure that they stem from the same core. So, for instance, I think my pursuit of writing also writing helps me connect with my inner compass. The kind of investing that I pursue, which is long term oriented, buying businesses rather than just stocks, not trying to speculate, instead viewing it as a part owner in the business. that is also in sync with my core. Now, if I was to, for instance, pursue short term trading, it would be something that I would fail at because it's not in sync with my core. So, in a way, that investing is also harmonized with my core. Increasingly, the corporate work that I do, whether it's coaching leaders or also helping companies with their vision, purpose, and their strategy, is also very long term, very centered in the company's DNA and so on. So, if I was to do something very transactional, for instance, or view an engagement with a company as just a short term gig and not have their long term interest in mind, once again, that would clash with the inner core. So it's still a challenge to physically switch from writing in the morning to, you know, doing a conference call with a company CEO or presenting to the board to evening, talking to a leader and, having him or her to look deeper into themselves and maybe writing an article on mindfulness in the night. It's still challenging to make this shift, frankly. But at least the fact that all of these things I'm doing with full involvement from myself is what helps. If I was to do something where, just as an example, if I was to do short term trading or just do a deal with a company because it's a transaction, it would be very difficult for me because it would drain me out. Whereas all these activities don't drain me out, they energize me. It still makes that shift quite difficult because the human mind is not wired to multitask. It's wired to go deep into one area and get into the zone. I try to manage this by trying to the extent possible, not have too many things happening in a single day and to instead split it. I read somewhere that I think, was it Jack Dorsey or Elon Musk? One of them, they run multiple companies, right? So they devote one day to one broad function. I think,
Organization.
yes, yes. And sometimes even to one activity. So one day is just focused on marketing or product management. So then, they're able to get deeper ideas. But honestly, to answer your question, it's still a work in progress. But the more integrated these things are, the better it is.
I think integration is a key, as you say. And does it stress you to say that today you are an author, you got to write that article that everybody likes? You're a coach, you got to give that fantastic advice to your clients so that they can kind of move forward. So does it stress you, put additional pressure on you to say that you got to get it right each time you take on these multiple roles? How does Venkatesh deal with this kind of conundrum?
Earlier in my career, I used to get quite stressed out about it. I used to suffer from this obsession with trying to be perfect. And I'm saying this not like, those interview questions where somebody asks you the weakness and you say, oh, my weakness is I'm too perfect. I'm not saying it like that. I realized that this trying for perfection was actually my own fear of failing, which was manifesting as this obsessive need for perfection. Once I learned to recognize that I could fail, that I could be wrong, that I have faults, once you learn to accept that about oneself, then the stress comes down a bit. Even now, I do get a bit stressed about it, but then I am able to remind myself that it's okay to fail, it's okay to make a mistake, as long as you're trying your best. My focus has shifted from the outcome to my effort.
And I think for a lot of us in this whole journey of wanting to get better as individuals, as professionals, there are bound to be one or missteps. How important is the support system or the network, and how can one tap into that in this journey?
So I think just having people around you with whom you can be yourself, with whom you can be vulnerable, really helps. And I think that just happens over time, whether it's family, whether it's very close friends. I think what's happening nowadays is with people having lower attention spans, a lot of our interactions have become increasingly transactional. Even quote unquote friends, a lot of it is not actual friends, it's more people with common interests who have come together. Now, that in itself is not a support network. Close friends are people with whom you can, who will stand by you through thick and thin. So I'm grateful to have family and friends who have, who are of support to me. And that is really important. I think, though, the biggest support over time comes from being in touch with your own inner compass and just allowing yourself to be vulnerable with yourself, because that really changes the game.
Great. So we've been talking about mindfulness, its benefits, the multiple roles that you have played, and how it has kind of helped you in good stead. Before we wrap up, I think it's about the practice of mindfulness itself. The failure points we did touch upon that. How do you kind of get over it, be more aware of it? But more specifically, if you were to kind of articulate your own mindfulness practice, what does it look like?
Well, I do about an hour a day in the morning before I start off with work. Uh, the particular type of mindfulness I technique that I follow is vipassana, which is basically observing the breath. I think the mistake a lot of people make is getting the thought into it. So the idea is not to think about the breath. The idea is not to count the number of breaths or any of those things. Those are all just mental processes. The idea is to just be in the presence and awareness of the breath. It's a practice, so it takes time to be able to uh, let go of these mental constructs and instead just be in awareness. There's no language, there's no thought when you're in awareness of the breath. So I do that for about an hour in the morning. The effort through the rest of the day is to stay with things which are close to my core. And when I do that, automatically I'm able to be mindful. So, whether it's writing, I try to do a couple of hours at least in the morning. Even in the advice that, I give companies, etc., later during the day, or the work that I do with companies, I try to be in awareness of what I'm doing. In some ways, being true to yourself and being true to your core, not doing something just because it has transactional value, really helps, because you can just be light. You don't need to think too much if you're just telling the truth all the time. So I just try to be in touch with my core and just, so even if sometimes the advice I give actually means I'll get less business from the company because I'm advising them not to do a particular acquisition, etc., it just helps me to be light and easy during the day. But yeah, that's what my practice looks like. The process of writing itself is, as I said, I try to do deep work. It takes some time to get into the zone. I try to make it uninterrupted. I'm able to catch small strands of thought and inspiration which go through my mind. It's a bit like, there's a whiff of a thought, about a plot point, for instance. So for instance, Victor Hugo, they say that the idea for Hunchback of Notre Dame came to him when he just saw a person kneeling in a cathedral or something like that. And sometimes you just have these whiffs of inspiration, but actually they have in them the seed for a whole book. So being in that deep work state allows me to catch those whiffs of inspiration.
Wonderful. And lastly, what has been the impact on personal leadership, corporate leadership through your work as mindfulness coach? What have you seen in close quarters?
Sure. So, I've just realized that what holds true in a microcosm also holds true for larger systems. There are more complex variables at play, but if one is able to see through with simplicity. So, just as an example, I talked about as an individual doing activities which are aligned with one's core, which is one's DNA. This holds true at a corporate level as well. Companies which which are cognizant and aware of their DNA, which for a company would mean the corporate values. Companies which have a strong sense of their core purpose, which is again aligned with their core DNA, and companies which take decisions, which is your strategy, which is again aligned with this. And lastly, companies which take care of their people as the storehouse of this corporate DNA, such companies do well. And a lot of my work, which is around helping companies, this is through my consulting firm, Mainspring Advisors, helping companies discover their purpose and vision, and also or define their vision, and also devise strategy which is in line with that, is aligned to this way of thinking, this integrated way of thinking.
So, in lot many ways, if we were to look at it, what mindfulness practice does to individuals is force that sense of alignment to everything that they're trying to do.
Yes, and the same holds true for larger systems like companies as well.
The more aligned it is, it's not about balance, it's more about alignment.
Correct. Absolutely.
Venkatesh, fantastic. I didn't know how time went by as we have been talking about this wonderful subject of mindfulness and your close insights around that. This show is all about creating ripples of inspiration. So before we sign off, what is your Inspire Someone Today message for all the listeners?
Well, I'd actually go back to the quote from the Tao Te Ching. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So dream big and start small.
Dream big, start small, micro steps for macro impact. Thank you for listening into today's edition of Inspire Someone Today. It's been a privilege to bring in these conversations. If you like this episode and have any feedback or comments, do mail me at inspiresomeonetodaypodcast@gmail.com. Inspiring someone is like creating ripples around us. If you like what to listen, feel free to share them and let's create ripples of inspiration. Do not forget to follow me on my Instagram handle @InspireSomeoneTodayPodcast for all the latest updates. This is Srikanth, your host, signing off, and until next time, keep inspiring.